Hey, this is Brandon with Pickleball Effect. Today we're going to review the new Perseus paddles by Joola. This is the paddle that Ben Johns has been playing with for the last several months, so naturally it's gotten a lot of attention and a lot of people have been interested in the release of this paddle. But on top of that, every single sponsored Joola player has switched to one of the variations of either this paddle or the Scorpius. So there's something about these paddles that all the pros think it's better than all the previous models that Joola has made. So that's what really piqued my interest in these and made me really interested in seeing how these played. I'm not going to dive too much into the construction of these paddles. Joola uses a lot of marketing jargon that I don't want to dissect, but I will say that these are thermoformed and have the foam injection around the perimeter, just like we're seeing from a lot of other brands, but there are a couple of things unique about these that I will point out when we look at the spec sheets. So these paddles come in a 16mm and a 14mm option. A couple of things that stand out to me here are the static weights. So the average weight of the 16mm is 8 ounces, while the average weight of the 14mm is 7.8 ounces. For thermoform paddles, these definitely are lighter average weights. Thermoform paddles just use more material. They have the foam injection around the perimeter. They have the carbon fiber frame around the edge. This is just more material, which equals more weight. So most other thermoform paddles on the market have a much higher static weight of 8.2 plus. So it's unique that these are coming in at a lighter static weight. Now I want to mention the swing weights. So the swing weights of my 16mm was 117. This is a very low measurement for an elongated paddle, especially for thermoform paddles. The only other paddle that's been close to this I've measured is the Carbon 3X 16mm, which came in at 119. All others are 121 plus. So that this have such a light swing weight is pretty significant. I think a lot of people are going to be attracted to that. But on my 14mm, it measured with a swing weight of 120, which is higher than the 16. This is also very unusual. Normally a 14mm is going to have a lighter swing weight than the 16mm, but that wasn't the case here. So I dug into this a little more and put the paddles on my balance point machine. And the balance point on my 14mm is higher up on the face, so it came in with a reading of 247mm, while the 16mm came in at 245mm. So all this means is that the balance point of the paddle is higher on the face on the 14 than on the 16, meaning the weight of the paddle is just shifted higher on the face, which is what's giving it that higher swing weight. And I actually think this could be a really good thing. So normally 14mm paddles just don't carry through the ball as well as 16mm paddles, and they kind of get pushed around. They're just not as stable. But having this higher swing weight and higher balance point might make the 14mm a little sturdier than other 14s I've played, so that's something I'll be paying attention to in the playtest. So the last thing I'll mention here are these twist weight measurements. So these measurements are lower than the average twist weight for elongated shapes. All this means is that when a ball hits the side of the paddle, these are going to be more likely to twist in your hands compared to some other elongated shapes that have higher twist weight measurements. So that's going to be another thing I'll be paying attention to, is just how stable the paddles are and how forgiving they are in the play test. And then of course there's the price. So these are retailing at a premium for $250. So I'll be just going to be paying attention to the value of the paddles, like do the performance justify the cost? But if you are interested in these, I do have a discount code that I have linked in the description below. So I have both the 16 and the 14mm that I'll be play testing. Let's go put these on the court and see how they play. After drilling and playing with the paddles for over 2 weeks, here are my thoughts on their performance. I'll start by talking about the 16mm, then I'll talk about the 14 and end with my recommendation. After doing a lot of side-by-side comparisons with the 16mm paddle and others that are out there, I decided to categorize it as a control paddle. It has a surprisingly soft and unique feel to it. It didn't have that distinct, stiff feel that thermoform paddles are known for. However, it wasn't as plush as the Hyperion 16mm. It felt a little more lively and crisp compared to the Hyperion, but softer than other thermoform paddles. I actually really liked how it felt, and it translated well to the soft game. I was connected to the ball and was able to dial in my soft game, though it didn't come immediately. The ball comes off just a touch hotter than the Hyperion, so if you're coming from a non-thermoform paddle, then expect some time to get used to it. But if you're coming from another thermoform paddle, then I suspect that you'll be able to control this one pretty quickly. The paddle's lighter swing weight really shone through. The paddle felt light and moved well. The edgeguard is even a little slimmer when you compare it to other 16mm paddles, and it all contributed to improved maneuverability. It's noticeably quicker than any other thermoform paddle I've played and is a unique selling point for the paddle in my opinion. I'm personally a sucker for a softer feeling paddle that's on the lighter side, so I like that combination. The paddle does have a smaller sweet spot compared to other thermoform paddles though, just like the lower twist weight suggested. I still say it's a good sized sweet spot, but it's not oversized like other thermos. I never felt like the size of the sweet spot really hindered my play, but if you're a lower level player, then this might be an issue. On the power side, it's a touch more poppy than the Hyperion, but when you hit it side by side with other thermoform paddles, it doesn't hit as hard. It's this sort of new age control paddle that gives you a little more power than what other control paddles have given you in the past, but with a similar level of control. And then with the spin, it has good spin numbers. My spin tests were coming in a high 1700 RPMs, which is plenty in my opinion and allows you to be aggressive when you want to with drives and rolls, but it doesn't top the charts when you compare it to other thermoform paddles. What's nice about this paddle coming in so light is that those who like lighter paddles can keep it stock, but it's like a blank canvas for those who like to customize their paddles with lead tape. I ended up adding 4 inches of lead tape to each corner like this, and then added some edge guard tape all around it. This edge guard tape is awesome, by the way. I'll put a link to it in my description if you're interested in picking some up. So here's how the specs changed with this tape setup. The static weight went from 7.85 ounces to 8.44. The swing weight went from 117 to 120. The twist weight changed from 587 to 664. And the balance point changed from 244 to 240. So I liked this paddle stock, but there are some benefits to adding lead tape with very few drawbacks. Despite the static weight jumping up half an ounce, the swing weight stayed low for an elongated paddle and only increased by 3 points, while the twist weight jumped nearly a full point, which made it more stable and forgiving. Then the balance point moves closer to your hand, which adds more feel and control to the paddle. I personally enjoyed this setup. Although I liked the paddle stock, the lead tape gave me more put away power and stability without sacrificing much maneuverability. Now let's talk about the 14mm. It had a similar feel to the 16, though it was a little firmer and denser feeling when you hit them side by side. However, when you compare it to 14mm thermoform paddles from Vatic Pro and 6.0, the Perseus does have a softer feel. The higher swing weight was nice, like I thought it might be. The paddle carried through the ball well and you could really rip drives and put balls away with power. Plus, it didn't feel flimsy or anything when dinking like some 14mm paddles do. It was a good jump in power over the 16mm, and I'm not sure whether to call it a power paddle or an all-court paddle, but it's somewhere in that range. Although it had a higher swing weight, its thinner core helped keep it maneuverable, and it has a more pleasant feel to it that feels better to me than the extra stiff feeling of other 14mm thermos. However, it did have a tighter sweet spot compared to the 16mm, which made it harder to play with. I noticed it most when resetting speed ups or defending drives. More of those shots ended up in the net than they did with the 16mm when I caught balls towards the edge of the paddle. The 14mm options from Vatic Pro and 6.0 are more forgiving than this one. Several of Joola's pros have opted to play with the 14mm version, I'm guessing for the extra power, but the everyday player will have a harder time playing with this one than with the 16mm, and I imagine more people would enjoy the 16mm. Adding some lead tape to the 14 did help with its stability, but it didn't feel like the big jump in stability that the 16mm got with the same amount of lead tape. On the control side, it takes longer to adjust to since it has that extra power, but it's really not that much harder to control. The main drawback to the soft game was just that it had that tighter sweet spot. So here's my recommendation. At $250, you are paying extra for the name, but I do think the 16mm in particular has some unique qualities like its lighter swing weight and better control that you won't find in other thermoform paddles that will make it worth the money for some players. If you're looking for the benefits of a thermoform paddle but in a more control-focused and lighter design, then this is a good option. I see this paddle as a standard for new generation control-oriented paddles that offer more offensive options than what control paddles of the past could offer. But if you're looking for bigger power, then I'd recommend other thermoform paddles. The 14mm was fun to play, but I do think it's more of an advanced paddle that should be reserved for higher level players looking for a strong hitting paddle with a pleasant feel to it and don't mind the smaller sweet spot. However, I think other 16mm thermos like the Carbon 1X or the Vatic Pro V7 give you good power too and are more forgiving and easier to play with than the Perseus 14mm, which I would recommend over the Perseus 14 for most players. So there you go. Thanks for watching and I hope it helped.